Right now, roughly 7 billion people are eating. It is a staggering number, mostly because for the vast majority of our history, we didn't have a plan. Homo sapiens sapiens, anatomically modern humans, have occupied this planet for about 200,000 years. For almost all of that time, we simply followed the food. Then something shifted. Between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, agriculture was born. The impact was immediate and mathematical. By the time of ancient Rome, the global population had climbed from a mere 10 million to roughly 250 million. From Rome until the present, that number exploded further, reaching the 7 billion mark. It is a simple sequence of events, but the stakes are absolute. Modern civilization, skyscrapers, and the internet would not have been possible without a few people noticing that seeds in the dirt eventually become food. For 250,000 years, humanity remained nomadic. This was the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, which constitutes nearly the entire span of human history. It was a straightforward survival strategy. You didn't own a house, you owned the movement. You tracked the seasons and the migrating herds, drifting across the land in search of calories and useful minerals. Until about 12,000 years ago, our ancestors were primarily hunter-gatherers. Their diet was a rotating menu of necessity. They spent their days chasing game, foraging for berries and mushrooms, and eating insects. It was a constant, steady walk across the landscape, a world where the only thing that stayed still was the stone tools they carried. No one was contemplating fences or urban planning. They were simply following the food, and the movements of the animals they chased served as the only map they ever needed. To understand why humans stopped moving, we have to look at the map. The last ice age began roughly 110,000 years ago and ended about 15,000 years ago. It was a cold, flat, and largely barren landscape. During the last glacial maximum, which spanned from 21,000 to 15,500 BCE, land temperatures were on average 20 degrees Celsius lower than they are today. Consider a world where the geography is physically different. In northern Europe and America, glacial sheets were up to 3 kilometers thick. That is a wall of ice that replaces entire mountain ranges. Because so much water was trapped in these frozen sheets, the oceans shrank. Sea levels were up to 100 feet lower than modern coastlines. Humans were not inventing the future. They were simply trying to avoid freezing. The logic of the Paleolithic was binary: move or starve. Move, or a slab of ice the size of a continent would simply erase you from the map. It was a row of cold, hard facts. Let's look at the math of survival. For a long time, the Earth's carrying capacity for human beings as hunter-gatherers was estimated at 10 million people. That is a hard ceiling. If you are a member of a tribe of 100 hunter-gatherers, you don't have a supermarket. You have the land. You need between 50 square kilometers and 500 square kilometers of territory to hunt and gather from just to avoid starvation. For context, that's roughly the size of a small city or a large airport, but you are the only ones allowed to use it. The scale of the world is suddenly very small. You are not moving through a landscape, you are managing a massive open-air pantry that requires constant migration. If the land fails, you move. But if the rest of the world is already full, there is nowhere left to go. Why did this shift actually happen? Historians aren't exactly in agreement. One theory for the emergence of agriculture is that positive climate change following the end of the Ice Age allowed the land to support crops. It was essentially a planetary upgrade in weather. Another theory suggests that the human brain may not have been capable of conceptualizing agriculture until the Neolithic period. In this version, it wasn't the soil that changed, but the hardware in our heads. Then there is the third theory. This one posits that increasing hunter-gatherer populations reached a critical mass where the food supply became fixed, and the rationing was no longer working. Necessity is the mother of invention. In this case, the invention was a seed in the dirt. Then we have the Levant, a region spanning the eastern Mediterranean, including modern-day Syria, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, and southeastern Turkey. This is where the framework of our modern life was first sketched. Between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, this area, known as the Near East, provided the earliest known evidence of crop cultivation, animal domestication, and the birth of permanent villages. This transition coincides with the Neolithic period. Around 12,000 years ago, we see the domestication of cereals, a process that reached a tipping point roughly 10,000 years ago, or 9600 BC. Because this shift happened across such a vast window of time, scholars find the period incredibly difficult to study. Meanwhile, on the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, the landscape began to change. Population numbers grew steadily, and with that growth came the emergence of new ritual practices. Humans weren't just changing what they ate, they were changing how they lived and what they believed. It was a quiet, slow-motion revolution. Around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, we enter the Mesolithic period. This was a transitional phase, a slow burn. The shift from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to agriculture was not a sudden flip of a switch. Instead, it was a result of overlapping processes that took many thousands of years to mature. It was a protracted human-plant liaison, a biological and cultural coevolution. Then, between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, the Neolithic period began. The term Neolithic literally means new stone, characterized by tools with a more polished appearance. This is where the structure of our current existence begins to take shape. Agriculture emerged as a dual effort, the domestication of animals for milk and meat, and the domestication of plants for a more predictable food supply. We stopped chasing the food and started managing the environment. We simply stayed put. China witnessed the birth of rice agriculture between 6,000 and 13,000 years ago, specifically along the Yangtze and Yellow River. Some evidence points to 7,000 BC, while other finds indicate a 12,000-year-old system. Meanwhile, in the Andes, potatoes and other high-altitude crops emerged thousands of years ago. By 7000 BC, agricultural villages had established themselves along the banks of the Nile in Egypt and on the highlands of New Guinea. 2,000 years after the emergence of farming in Asia and Egypt, around 5000 BC, farming took hold in parts of South America and the river basin of central Mexico. Finally, the process reached North America around 2000 BCE. The survival strategy had finally arrived in every corner of the globe. By the 7th millennium, the map of the Near East began to change. The first proto-cities emerged, marking a shift from small clusters of huts to something more permanent and structured. But these early hubs were limited by the rain. A millennium after the proto-cities, humans developed irrigation. This single technical shift allowed settlers to spread into the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, where the soil was rich but the water was unpredictable. It worked. Over the next 2,000 years, this ability to move water led to the emergence of the world's first true cities. Ownership changed the way humans saw the ground beneath their feet. Hunter-gatherers viewed land as territory to wander over, but agriculturalists cared more about property and land ownership. They weren't just moving through a space, they were claiming it. This shift in mindset created a new structural void that needed filling. Specialization in agricultural societies allowed for the development of professional warriors and advanced weaponry. Now the community didn't just need people to grow food, it needed people whose entire job was to protect that food from everyone else. It is a strange realization that the entirety of modern human history, every war, every empire, every piece of software, rests on a biological accident. We spent 200,000 years as guests of the landscape, and then, in a geological heartbeat, we decided to own it. We traded the freedom of the horizon for the security of a fence. We stopped following the herds and started counting the seeds. The result was a population explosion that took us from 10 million people to 7 billion, turning a few patches of fertile soil in the Levant into the foundation of the global economy. We are now living in a world built by people who simply noticed that if you leave a seed in the dirt, it comes back. Whether this was a brilliant invention or a trap we walked into remains an open question.